Hi guys, today we're going to talk about Hilt's feature of multiple bindings for the same type. Basically, it allows us to provide, you could say, different flavors or configurations of the same type that we have. I've built a news application that has different types, different flavors of a news repository type. So we'll look into it and we will see how we can apply these concepts to our application.
So on this page, we basically request the articles from the newsapi.org and immediately store them in our database. Now we have also a second screen which shows our saved articles. At this point we don't have any, so it doesn't show any articles, but this screen doesn't need a network connection because all it does is it retrieves the saved articles and it therefore can just get them from our database. So in order to save the article, we have to go back, and here we just click some of them and we go back and see this. So this is how the app functions. Now let's see how dependencies are implemented. This is how the dependencies are implemented right now in our app. In the center, we have our news repository, and at the top, we have the remote data source and the local data source. The news repository depends on our remote data source and the local data source, and this dependency is then injected into our main view model and into our favorite articles view model. While there's nothing wrong with this setup, let's optimize our news repository so that it gets the needed set of data sources for each of the screen. This is what I want to arrive at in terms of dependencies in my application. As you remember, our main screen both fetches our articles from the remote data source and it stores it. So inside our main view model, I want to have a news repository that both has access to our remote data source and a local data source to store the articles after they were fetched. But on the other hand, in our screen where we have our favorite articles, I want to have a favorite articles view model that has a news repository which only has a local data source, because all it does is retrieves articles from the database and we don't need a remote data source in our news repository here. So now I just want to show you the code of our application. Here we have the main view model, which all it does is it injects our news repository. And here we have our favorite article view model, which does exactly the same. All it does is injects our news repository as well. Next up, we have the news repository interface. All it does, it's a simple interface that has methods that our news repository implementation will implement. Next, we have the news repository implementation, which accepts our news data source and our article DAO. And I'm specifically not showing you guys the actual implementation of the class because all we care about at this point is our dependencies. And finally, we have our repository module where we wire everything together. Here we provide our news repository. We pass in our news remote data source and the article DAO, and we pass that all into our news repository implementation, which we then bind to our news repository. Now let's see how we can change our code in order to provide a different implementation of our news repository that doesn't have an article DAO. Okay, now we're ready to start defining different instances of our news repository type. To begin with, we need to define something called qualifiers. Qualifiers are basically like labels that tell Hilt what flavor of our type we want to provide. So for our news repository, we'll probably have two flavors. One which will be a universal one with both the remote data source and the local data source, and another one will be just the local data source. So let's begin by defining our qualifiers. First, we have to create a file where we'll define them. Let's create a file, NewsRepository qualifiers. And here's going to be quite a bit of code, but it's really not that complex. So first we have to declare that we want a qualifier by saying qualifier. And after that, we have to mention the retention. And here's going to be actually runtime. And finally, we define the name of our qualifier. So the first one will be the universal one, which will have both the local and the remote data source. So we'll say universal. And the second qualifier will be, the code is the same, but we'll just have a different name. And it's going to be, it's not going to be remote, it's going to be a cache one. And that's pretty much it for the qualifiers. Now we can tell Hilt that we want these two different instances of our news repository. Now that we have defined this, let's go ahead and assign these qualifiers to our different news repositories that we're going to define in our repository module. So we already have one defined, and this one actually has both the news remote data source and our database. So we can just label it with our universal qualifier because it's going to have both of our data sources. Now, the next one is our news repository that won't have our news remote data source. So for that, we need to first go to our implementation, and let's make our news remote data source optional one. So we'll just give it a null by default, and now it's optional. And the next step is we can define the second instance of our news repository. We can just copy this over. Now this one we can label with cache because it's not going to have a remote data source. We can delete it from the dependencies that it needs. And we can delete it here. And we just need our article DAO so we can just assign it. Okay, so now we have two different instances configured differently in our repository module. One will be universal one, but that has both the remote data source and the local database, and another one will be just our repository that has only our database. Okay, so now for the final step, we need to actually take these labels and put them in the place where we want these dependencies provided. So we will put the universal one into our main screen, and we'll put this one in our favorite articles. So let's go and do that. Okay, we're in our main view model, and it needs a news repository that has both our remote and local data source. So we can annotate it with our universal label. Great. Now let's go on to our favorite articles view model. As you remember, it retrieves articles from the database. So here we don't need our remote data source or a news repository that has our remote data source. And we can annotate this with cache because we want a news repository that has only our database, and that's it. Okay, so for our final step, I want to actually verify that these dependencies that we're generating here, that these are the actual dependencies that we are receiving in our favorite articles view model and in our main view model. So here I want to make sure that I receive the universal one, and here I want to make sure that I get the cache one. And to do that, we can log the hash code of our generated news repositories. So I will log here the hash code of our universal one while it's being generated, and here I will log the hash code of our cache one while it's being generated. And respectively, in the main view model, once we initialize it, I will log the hash code of our universal one, and in our favorite articles view model, I will also do the same. Okay, so I ran the app, and straight away we're opening our main screen with the main view model. So let's confirm that we're getting the same instance from our repository module, and the main view model gets the same instance, and we can look in the logcat. And here in the logcat, we can see that in the repository module, this is the hash code of our news repository, and this is the one that we're getting in the main view model. So let's do the same for our favorite articles view model. Let's go to the favorite articles, and let's confirm that we're getting the same instance. And here is also the call when we're generating our news repository in the repository module. Here's the hash code, and we can confirm that we're getting the same instance in our favorite articles view model.
So that's pretty much it for our tutorial. Hilt's feature of multiple bindings for the same type is a powerful feature that you can use in a variety of ways in your application. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please drop a like and subscribe if you like it. I'll see you in the next video.